Throughout history, there have been chilling eras where torture and executions were shockingly commonplace. Imagine a time when the anguished cries of prisoners echoed endlessly behind grim fortress walls, and the streets bathed red with blood, turning public squares into grim lakes of despair. Join us as we delve into the most brutal punishments in human history. Number 20. The Iron Maiden. The Iron Maiden, reputedly used in the Middle Ages for torture and execution, is depicted variably as a tall box with spikes or blades inside. Descriptions range from a human-shaped sarcophagus to a cylindrical case with a woman's head. In one version, a vertical sarcophagus with spikes would close slowly, impaling the victim from both sides. Another variant, attributed to Spartan ruler Nabis, involved a female statue with nails that embraced and pierced the condemned. Despite these accounts, many historians consider the Iron Maiden a myth, as the earliest examples date from the 16th century, and evidence of its historical use is lacking. Existing museum specimens are reconstructions of this legendary device. Number 19. Burning at the stake. In execution by burning, a person was bound and placed on a pile which was then set on fire, subjecting the victim to the flames. The process of burning could be slow and extremely painful. Often the executioners kept an eye on the flames, preventing them from getting too hot, deliberately prolonging the victim's agony. One of the most famous examples of the use of execution by burning is the period of the Age of Witches in Europe. Women accused of witchcraft association with the devil or committing various unexplained phenomena were considered witches and were subject to this method of execution, though the majority of victims were men also suffered this fate. The process of accusing and executing witches was used, usually full of superstition, improper trials and torture to coerce confessions. Often the trial lasted only a couple of minutes, during which time the accused was read the charges and immediately found guilty without being given a chance to defend themselves. But beyond witches, this execution was very closely intertwined with the Holy Inquisition, and probably even became its symbol. The historian Hernando Dilgar estimated that between 1,478 and 1,490 to 2,000 people were burned at the stake, and how many more people were burned alive during the entire period of the fight against heresy can only be guessed. Ancient Rome also used this type of execution. The Roman state regarded burning at the stake as a horrible punishment, intended as a demonstration of power and intimidation. The Moscow kingdom also liked to execute people by burning, but they had their own interesting variation of this execution there. It was more like being smoked alive rather than burned. For example, in 1701, it was applied to men who distributed leaflets defaming the honor of Peter the Great. For this they were suspended on a scaffold, and for 8 hours they were smoked with a corrosive composition from which the condemned men lost all the hair on their bodies, and their skin melted like wax. However, it is not known for sure whether they were smoked to death because different sources speak about different things. Number 18. The Blood Eagle, perhaps one of the Kruistvik kings. The execution supposedly originated during the early Middle Ages in Scandinavia, and was usually applied to high-ranking enemies taken prisoner. For example, it is mentioned that the Anglo-Saxon king Ella, who killed Ragnar Lothbrok, the father of Ivar the Boneless, was executed in this way as revenge. The execution consisted of breaking the victim's ribs on the sides with an axe, then making incisions and pulling out the ribs to resemble wings. After that, the still alive victim would have his lungs pull out and placed so that breathing would make the improvised wings move. After all this, the still living person was tied up on ropes and lifted up for public viewing. It is assumed that this execution was not only a cruel method of murder and intimidation, but also some kind of religious sacrifice in the name of the supreme Scandinavian god Odin. However, the existence of this execution is highly doubtful, because the fact of Ragnar Lothbrok or Ivar the Boneless has never been proven by anything but sagas and legends. As for King Ella, the exact details of his death, except that he died in battle with the Normans, are unknown. But unlike the Blood Eagle, the following execution existed and probably was not inferior in cruelty and sophistication. Number 17. Crushing with stones or elephants execution. by crushing is one of the oldest methods of execution. It is based on the use of various heavy objects to crush the victim's entire body or individual limbs, resulting in a painful and often slow death. There are several variants and methods of application of classical execution. By crushing, the perpetrator is secured on a wheel or platform, and then a heavy object, such as a large stone or roller, is lifted over them, which is gradually lowered or dropped all at once. Crushing the person, the criminal is secured on a special platform, and the executioners then use a V to crush the convict's limbs, causing fatal injuries. The criminal is placed on the ground, and then large heavy stones are placed on his body one by one until the victim dies. But there are also particularly sophisticated ways to crush a person. For example, in the south and southeast of Asia, a popular method of execution was when a bound man was laid on the ground, and then an elephant stepped on him. This method was quite well established in that area because it was used for more than 4,000 years. To give an example from more recent history, we can remember the case of the Salem witch trials, and even though we associate the Ceylon witch trials with the burning of those accused of witchcraft at the stake. Number 16. The breaking wheel. This is an ancient method of torture and execution, first used in ancient Rome. One of its early adopters was the notoriously cruel Roman Emperor Commodus. In those times, executions were performed publicly, but evolved differently in the Middle Ages. For instance, in the Holy Roman Empire, executions became mass spectacles, primarily for men convicted of aggravated murder, often committed during another crime, or against a family member. Records from the Holy Roman Empire provide detailed descriptions of these executions. The process began with the criminal being placed belly down, hands and feet tied to a board, and dragged by a horse to the execution site. There, the executioner would strike the criminal's arms twice, once above and once below the elbow, and do the same to the legs above and below the knee. The final 9th blow would be delivered to the spine, breaking it. The broken body would then be woven into the wheel spokes, which was then mounted on a pole fixed vertically into the ground. The criminal was left to die exposed, and in agony. Another European variation involved placing the wheel on a tripod and rotating it while the convict was tortured. This method allowed spectators to view the process from all angles without the executioner having to move around the wheel. Sometimes the criminal's ankles and wrists were broken beforehand to twist them into the wheel, intensifying the suffering. One of the most infamous uses of the breaking wheel occurred on October 1st, 1786 in the county of Texas Berg. Heinrich Stahl was sentenced to be executed by the wheel for the aggravated murder of a Jew. The first blow aimed to crush his chest and kill him instantly, but it failed. Even the townspeople, accustomed to public executions, were horrified by the brutality, as Stahl remained alive throughout the ordeal after being secured to the wheel and hoisted onto a pole. Number 15. The Judas cradle. The Spanish Inquisition invented this torture device to punish heretics who did not embrace official church beliefs or committed serious crimes against the church and its representatives. This torture device was invented by the lawyer Ippolito Marsili. The instrument itself was a wooden structure on 4 legs in the shape of a pyramid, over which a bound prisoner was suspended. Usually, the Judas cradle was used during interrogations. With each wrong answer or refusal to answer, the suspect was lowered and lower, as a result of which the person was literally strung with the crotch area on the pyramid's tip under the force of his own weight, which caused severe pain and damage to both the upper tissues and internal organs. If the accused was particularly uncooperative, a weight was tied to his legs, which caused additional pressure and allowed him to inflict even greater suffering and damage to the person. The interrogation itself was conducted during the day, and at night, the person was left in a hanging state to bleed and repent of his sins. Due to the effectiveness of interrogation with this instrument and the repentance of criminal, the instrument was nicknamed the Cradle of Judas in honor of the most famous religious traitor. Death from this torture more often came not so much from injuries as from blood poisoning caused by the fact that the tip of the pyramid was never washed. Number 14. Waterboarding. This is probably one of the mildest tortures on our list. Even according to the Spanish Inquisition, where it was widely used, this torture was considered medium severity. However, it turned out to be so effective that it is used by the special forces of some countries even in the modern world. The essence of the torture consisted of the victim being tied to a bench or suspended above the floor by his limbs. After securing and immobilizing the person, water was poured on his face in a constant stream so that he could not breathe at a normal pace, but at the same time could not die of asphyxiation. Although the person did not feel any pain in the process and was not injured in reality, the feeling of constantly pouring water on the face, which flows into the nose and mouth and prevents breathing, caused the victim to constantly feel as if he was on the verge of death, which consequently put the person in extreme panic. In such a state, a person was ready to confess to anything and deny any views that prompted the torture. This method of torture may look like something ancient, but waterboarding was openly used even by the CIA and the US police up until the 1940s in the USSR, for example. It was used by the police until the collapse of the Soviet Union, and even in modern Russia. It is fairly popular to extract confessions from people about crimes they did not commit. It is known that this torture has changed its form numerous times. For example, in the USSR, in Russia, a gas mask with a tube, with something put on the victim, the end of which was dipped into a basin or bucket of water, so that the person simply filled the gas mask with water in an attempt to breathe. The Chinese people had their own method that literally drove people crazy. It consisted of the guilty person being put on a chair and tied up and above him on a SP special structure. A bucket or vat with water with a hole was put through which the water slowly dripped on the victim's head. Just imagine the feeling of water slowly dripping on your head. There's nothing you can do about it. It literally drove people crazy. Also, there was an even worse version of waterboarding in the Middle Ages. For this, a funnel was inserted into the victim's throat to prevent him from closing his mouth, and then water was directly poured in until the belly of the condemned person swelled up and the water started to come out again. Number 13, the White Room. This is a relatively modern type of torture that focuses primarily on the psychological effects on a person. This torture involves the victim being locked in a completely white room, often with padded and soundproof walls, to achieve the effect of complete sensory deprivation, that is, isolation of the person from any external stimuli. The room may also be kept constantly lit. In such conditions, it is impossible even to track the time of day, let alone sleep. And if there is a need to go to the toilet, the person must slip a white sheet of paper under the door. In this case, he can go to the toilets accompanied by a guard who, by the way, wear specially designed shoes that do not make noise when walking. This method of torture may seem very mild and not cruel to some people, but in fact it may well lead to irreparable psychological injuries due to the fact that the brain, in an attempt to occupy itself with something, can create intrusive thoughts, and a person with a weak psyche may even cause injury to himself. One of the most famous victims of the White Room, Iranian journalist Ibrahim Nabavi, said in an interview that the worst thing about this method of torture is that afterward, you will never be free another victim. Amir Abbas Vakar said that after 8 months of life in the White Room, he forgot even the faces of his mother and father. And after his release, he was never able to return to a normal life, even with short periods of isolation. Number 12, the German chair. Although this torture was invented in medieval Europe, its greatest spread and popularity was during the Syrian War. This method of torture is very similar to the well-known wreck it is based on, stretching the victim's muscles, ligaments, and joints. However, the main difference is that the pressure is not evenly distributed between the person's limbs due to their stretching, but is directed at the spine. The essence of the process is as follows. A person's hands and legs are tied, and then the victim is placed on the chair so that his spine or abdomen is on the seat. The process of torture itself begins when the executioner starts to turn the chair so that the entire weight of the victim is focused on a small part of the spine or abdomen. Such torture could last several hours a day and result in serious injuries. Mr. Shahan told the Daily Mail that he was stripped naked and placed on a chair on his stomach. In this position, he was tortured for 2 to 12 hours a day for 4 days. According to him, the torture was so horrific that at one point he started begging to be killed. Number 11, rat torture. This was very popular in ancient China but became famous largely due to the 16th century Dutch revolutionary leader Diode Sono. It is probably one of the simplest and cruelest. TV rope and a few rats to begin. The victim was placed on a table, after which the hands and feet were securely bound and the cage was placed on the person's stomach. The cage had a very simple design. It had no bottom, and at the top, there was a special hole through which the rats were inserted. Then a mesh with embers was placed inside. Because of the high temperature, the rats began to panic, and since they could not bite through the cage bars, the easiest way to get out was through the human body. The animals began to gnaw their way to freedom through the flesh and entrails of a still living human. It's not hard to imagine how agonizing such torture was. Number 10. Tickling. This may sound like a joke, but has been used as a full-fledged form of torture in many countries. For example, in ancient China, tickling was used to torture both common prisoners and nobles. This method was very convenient, especially in relation to the nobility, because it did not leave scars and did not lead to physical injuries. But at the same time, it allowed one to obtain from the victim all the necessary information, because some cannot bear a couple of seconds of tickling while the torture could last for several hours or even a whole day. Even the ancient Romans used tickling. They invented their own special process for this torture. The victim was tied up and his feet were dipped in salt water, after which the person was placed on a bench or sat on a chair with straightened legs, and a goat was brought in to lick the salt water off his feet. Over time, the tickle would stop feeling like a tickle, and the goat's tongue would become more like a razor. The man would literally start to feel pain. Perhaps this kind of torture does not look serious, but according to some information, it was used even in Nazi Germany. Those guys were good at inhumane abuse. In addition, in reality, prolonged tickling is life-threatening, because continuous laughter raises the intracranial pressure, which in consequence can lead to rupture of an aneurysm and death. Number 9. Schism. Are you afraid of insects, or maybe you were claustrophobic? In any case, you are very lucky to live in the 21st century, and not in the days of ancient Persia, where you could be subjected to an execution called schism. The essence of the execution was to cause prolonged torment in the convict. A person was stripped naked, after which they would be given milk and smeared with honey, so that they would have severe diarrhea. Then the offender was placed in a boat covered with a tree or similar boat on top, and lowered into the water, always in a small pond with stagnant water. Under such conditions, and even with diarrhea, a person began to exude a strong stench that attracted insects. They flew in and began their feast in addition to honey and waste products. The insects did not disdain to eat the flesh of the person himself, after which they left their eggs and larvae. Under the skin, all this caused infections and gangrene, due to which a person began to literally rot alive. All of these caused exhaustion of the body and septic shock, due to which the person died. Number 8. Half-hanging, drawing, and quartering. This may sound a little like the name of a dish in a restaurant. For the first time, this type of execution arose in England during the reign of Henry III. It was applied exclusively to male traitors. The victim was first tied to a stretch made of wooden boards, after attaching them to the horse's harness. After that, the person was dragged to the place of execution. The stretcher was designed so that the executed would rub against the ground and wash the skin all the time. While traveling to the place upon arrival, the convict was hanged, but they didn't let him die because he still had a whole session of painful procedures ahead of him. After partial hanging, he would be castrated, causing him to experience pain and depriving the traitor of his manhood. The 5th item on this terrible list was quartering. Fortunately, by this time, the condemned man would already be dead and not feel any more agony. The lifeless body was deprived of all limbs, the end of which was the head, which was often hung in a public place as a warning to the rest. This execution was very symbolic, because the person who betrayed the crown and his monarch violated the vow of allegiance, which deprived him of the right to be a man, which is why he was castrated. 7. Pouring metal into the throat. Have you ever been burnt by super hot tea? So this is something similar. They give you water not with sweet tea but with liquid metal, and they pour not a couple of drops but about a liter, or even more. It is not difficult to guess that such a punishment was extremely painful, and due to the vitality of our body could stretch for quite a long time. Not for a few days, as in schism of course, but even 3 to 5 minutes was enough for the convict to regret not only his misdeed, but also that he was born at all. Such a punishment was applied to counterfeiters, which is somewhat ironic because money at that time was cast from precious metal alloys, by the way. One of the first cases of using such an execution was recorded back in the days of the Roman Empire in 53 BC. Number 6 copper bull or Ferris bull. This execution method was used on Sicily in the second half of the 6th century BC. This execution tool has a rather unusual history of creation. Its peculiarity is that the coppersmith Peril who created it became its first victim immediately after demonstrating the bull to Ferris and all of that, because the king was a very mentally unstable person, and at that moment considered that it was worth punishing Peril for his cruel product. Its name fully describes the product. It was made of copper and was a life-sized statue of a bull inside. There was a cavity in which, through a door on the side, they put the condemned to death in the nose of the bull. There were 2 narrowed holes, which also had their own purpose. The temperature inside the statue rose sharply, causing all the liquid in the human body to begin boiling and evaporating. The victim felt unbearable pain. If you have ever sunbathed under the sun, try to remember that feeling, and imagine being confined in a cramped space where it is impossible to hide from the heat. This brought the executed to mortal cries, which, coupled with steam, came from the nose of the statue and emitted a piercing whistle. Ferris enjoyed the whistle as he watched the man boil slowly inside the bull. Ironically, the tyrant himself had the opportunity to fully try out this tool for execution. After all, after his overthrow in 554 BC, he was executed in his favorite bull. Number 5. 1,000 cuts or linki. The first state where such an execution was used was ancient Rome. Zero Conch turned out to be a student of Cicero who allegedly betrayed him, which did not please the philosopher. They forced the young man to cut off the flesh from himself, fry it, and eat it. Unfortunately, a more detailed history of the conflict is unknown now about China. These guys always knew how to make a person regret his crimes. In their interpretation, the execution was called lingi, which means death by 1,000 cuts. This method of punish existed for a long time in the Middle Kingdom and was used until 1905. Mostly parasites and state traitors were punished in this way. The convict was tied to a pole in a place where a lot of people passed, preferably on a market square. Number 4. Death by sawing. This execution was invented in Europe during the Roman Empire, becoming popular in the Middle Ages, especially in Spain. However, it was most widely used in India and China. The essence of the execution fully corresponds to its name. A person sentenced to sawing by the legs and arms was tied between 2 pillars and sawed with a 2-handed saw along the body starting from the groin. The executioners themselves did not like this execution very much because it was slow and inconvenient to see the swaying body in Europe. However, a person was sawed not vertically but horizontally, which saved the executioner from such a problem. Number 3. Sacrificing. The Aztecs were a fairly advanced civilization with their own logographic writing systems, technologies, and culture. They occupied a large territory, yet despite all this, the Aztecs are best known for their brutal religion. According to some estimates throughout their history, the Aztecs sacrificed around 136,000 people to the gods. Although this figure is often disputed, historians agree on one thing. The scale of Aztec sacrifices was unmatched in all of America, and possibly even in the world. The victim was first painted blue, then led to the top of the pyramid, where a priest awaited the captive was placed on a stone table, and the priest, using an obsidian knife, cut open the victim's chest and ritually removed their heart while they were still alive. Number 2. Crucifixion. Used by the Romans. It was a punishment designed to maximize pain and humiliation. Crucifixion wasn't just about death. It was about sending a message. Victims were nailed or tied to a large wooden cross and left to hang until they succumbed to exhaustion, exposure, and suffocation. It could take hours or even days to die, with every breath becoming more and more agonizing. It was a slow and torturous death. The weight of the body would pull down on the outstretched arms, causing intense pain as the legs weakened. The victim would be forced to push up to breathe, leading to excruciating cycles of pain and relief. Dehydration, exposure, and blood loss would eventually lead to death, but not before a prolonged period of unimaginable suffering. The most famous victim of crucifixion is undoubtedly Jesus Christ, but thousands of others suffered the same fate. The public nature of the execution served as a stark warning to anyone who dared defy the Roman Empire. Number 1. Impalement. Finally, we travel to medieval Europe, where impalement was used to instill fear and maintain order. This gruesome method involved skewering the victim on a large stake. Impalement was not just about death, it was about prolonged suffering. The stake was carefully inserted to avoid vital organs, ensuring a slow and agonizing demise. Victims could linger for days, enduring unimaginable pain before finally succumbing. The process began with the victim being bound and often gagged to muffle their screams. The executioner would then drive the stake through the body, sometimes starting from the groin or the rectum, and ensuring it avoided the heart to prolong life. The stake would then be planted into the ground, leaving the victim to die slowly, impaled and exposed. One of the most notorious figures associated with impalement was Vlad the Impaler, also known as Dracula. His reign of terror in Wallachia was marked by thousands of such executions, creating a legacy of horror that endures to this day. The sheer brutality of impalement, combined with the terror of a prolonged death, made it one of the most feared punishments in history. These punishments remind us of the darkest aspects of human nature and the lengths to which societies have gone to maintain control and instill fear. If you found this video intriguing, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most shocking and brutal practices. And remember, the past may be behind us, but its lessons are always relevant.